Welcome back. Thanks for staying on with us here on In Focus. The Hawks pounced on and took into custody former Transnet CEO Brian Molefe and former CFO Anoj Singh this morning. They appeared in court over fraud and corruption charges involving former Transnet CEO Siyabonga Gama. They have since been released on bail. Meanwhile, in a move to signal a strong intent to prosecute corruption, President Cyril Ramaphosa finally unveiled his 9-member National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, first mentioned in his State of the Nation address last year. Joining us now to discuss whether South Africa may be finally turning the tide on corruption in the country is Corruption Watch Executive Director Karam Singh. Karam, good evening and good to have you with us tonight up here on In Focus. Look, it's taken a while, but we are here. Is it a question of better late than never?
Good evening, Talbo. Good evening to your viewers. Thanks again for having me on your program. Better late than never. Yeah, I suppose we could look at it that way. We've had something called the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which was approved by Cabinet last year, which is a strategy that's meant to take us up to 2030. And critical to the rollout of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy is the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, commonly known as the NACAC. The announcement of the composition of this council has been imminent for some time, so it is a little bit overdue, but it is a welcome news indeed, and should pave the way for some for the implementation of the strategy, including some new institutional arrangements to lead our fight against corruption.
What are the pillars, the gist of the proposed programs that will be undertaken by this council?
Primarily, I think the council is meant to roll out the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. But I think tied to that is also fundamentally a review of the institutional arrangements that guide our fight against corruption. You'll remember that we had the Glenister judgment in 2011, which looked at the dissolution of the Scorpions and whether the Hawks were a sufficient anti-corruption body. And the court found in that matter that it wasn't sufficient, that it didn't meet the requirements in the Bill of Rights or in terms of South Africa's obligations in terms of the UN Convention Against Corruption. So I think what's really envisioned institutionally now is the establishment of some type of a special statutory body or a constitutionally protected body that could be what some call an integrity commission, or could be a really based on international best practice, effective single anti-corruption commission, a commission that could build upon the existing capacity of organizations like the SIU, like the FIC, and ultimately drive both investigations and prosecutions, asset recovery and debarment.
Part of the framework of the anti-corruption strategy, it provides for a plan in which, for example, there is a culture of zero tolerance towards corruption in any sector, and there is full accountability for those involved. I just asked myself, is that even possible in a space where, there are deviations or things like that, or where there is a tolerance for what they say it's not corruption but is unauthorized expenditure and things like that? Is there space to say we can have zero tolerance towards corruption in this sector, and are we setting ourselves up for conflict here?
Well, we may be setting ourselves up for an impossible task. I mean, what you point out is that, how bad corruption has really gotten in the country. Some people would say that we have endemic corruption, but I think what you're pointing to is a kind of state of maladministration where things just don't work, people aren't doing their jobs. It may not be corruption per se, but it's just the fundamental inefficiencies of government. I think we need to distinguish that from what a kind of pointed and dedicated fight against corruption might be. And while zero tolerance might be aspirational, might be too optimistic, we certainly can focus our efforts and increase our capacity to combat the kind of systemic corruption that we've seen that led to state capture, that led to the sort of PPE debacle, and even, the anxiety that was felt earlier this year about the possibility that relief that would go to the KZN flood circumstances would end up being stolen money. So, we can certainly do a lot more in terms of pursuing governance and integrity within the state, but we certainly can do a lot more in terms of resourcing, ensuring specialized skills and training for our law enforcement to recapacitate both the police and the prosecution services that were badly hobbled under state capture.
One would say we are relying a lot here in terms of the names that have been put forward for the 3-year term on the capacity of the business sector and somewhat on civil society, assuming that these are organizations that are value-based or at least driven in a value-based manner. But then again, one would argue and say, wait a minute, Bain and Co. and other such auditing firms, it's not necessarily a cut and dry situation where we say we've got some private sector players in civil society and so everything will go okay. So who will police the police, so to speak?
Look, I think you point to an important fact that corruption is pervasive across our society. It's not a problem that's exclusive to government or the public sector. We see serious corruption challenges across the private sector and even in civil society and in the NGO sector we have issues of corruption. But in order to fight corruption, I think what the National Anti-Corruption Strategy says is that we need a total society approach. It needs to be based upon a pillar of active citizenry around enhanced whistleblower protection and support, and that there is a fundamental role for civil society and for the private sector to play in advising government in terms of how do we get out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves, how do we revive the spirit of 1994 and of the hope and promise of a constitutional democracy where rights are realized and where service delivery is realized, because we know that that's ultimately where corruption hits hard. It hits hard in the education sector, it hits hard in the health sector, and it hits hard where we're looking at the basic provisions of rights and the fight against inequality. Corruption exacerbates all of those challenges. So, we're never going to achieve the developmental potential of the country until we fundamentally turn the tide against corruption. So, this is not a silver bullet. I don't think it's even a new dawn, but it's certainly a new chapter, and it's a step in the right direction.
Coordinating such a complex and a diverse issue as corruption, one would say, certainly requires a lot of political will, especially if we are talking about elected representatives in all the organs of state and state institutions that are supporting our constitutional democracy. Now, this council is, from what I'm reading, going to be having to be working with ministers to enhance, for example, their oversight responsibility. Now, you cannot command political will, so to speak. You can maybe command an expression of political will. Are we going to see a situation where ministers and the council are going to be at each other's throat?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I think you're right to flag political will as something which is variable, that kind of blows with the wind, that is enhanced prior to elections and prior to seeking votes, but can wane when it comes to the backroom deals that politicians make with each other. That's why I think it's important that this council is fundamentally not made up of politicians, but is made up of academics, of activists, even some prominent whistleblowers. So, ultimately the council and the role that the council is going to play in terms of driving the implementation of the strategy is something which needs to sort of fly above politics and not be subjected to political will. Ministers will come and go, presidents will come and go, but I think what we're talking about now is ensuring that we put in place the right policies, the right institutional framework to take us, beyond the next election, so that we can have something which is durable that protects us from the state ever being captured again.
Yeah. Seeing it's taken us this long to put together this transitional body that is going to look at the strategic issues of implementation, including research and the conceptualization or development of documents, how long do you think we're going to take or before we have this overarching statutory body that is entrenched within the state body itself?
So the National Anti-Corruption Strategy talks about a 2-year period. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The policy framework is already in place. The international best practice that we understand is pretty commonly understood across a number of sectors, including within law enforcement and within other areas where policy has been developed. So I don't think this new council is working from a blank slate. I think they're working from a position of knowing really what's the right thing to do, and it's a question of now sort of driving implementation of new policies, of not being defeatist around the potential for a real fundamental institutional response, and really being bold, being really as bold as is required to respond to the boldness of those who previously captured our state, those who are clever enough to engage in sophisticated syndicated criminal activity involving money laundering. I mean, what we're up against is serious, so it's a serious challenge, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're not working from a clean slate.
Karam Singh, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on, Executive Director at Corruption Watch there, responding to the appointment of those members, 9 members to the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council.